Thank you and welcome. Um, Preparing this lecture about Bitcoin has been quite an experience. There is an amazing amount of information out there on the web. And I assume by your presence here, you want at least to get some sort of introduction before you start exploring what's available out there. Initially, I sent in this proposal for this about, in May, and the amount of development that's gone on in Bitcoin and digital currencies in general since May is just astounding. So I probably wouldn't have organized the things the same way, given the chance, if I'd written this or written the proposal in October or November, because so much has happened. Anyway, so I wanted to start out with sort of an introduction to the cryptography that's used. How many people are very familiar with cryptography and know all about it? So I always like to try to ask the question so that you have to raise your hand. If it's sort of like, does anybody not know about cryptography? And then nobody will still raise their hand. So I always like to ask them a different way. Because cryptography gives us confidentiality and integrity by its very nature, and that's what we use it for, which are at least two legs of what security is about. So cryptography helps us with at least two of those legs, the other one being availability. And I know I put this up here and I'm going to trip over it at some point, so if I fall flat and disappear behind the desk, you'll know what happened. Okay, so in Bitcoin, the primary use of cryptography is for integrity. There is the wallet you have to protect from alteration. Transactions have to be protected from alteration. You have to protect the blockchain, and you have to authenticate the wallet ownership. I really am going to do that. Okay. So the major crypto families. There's symmetric encryption. That's where there is a single shared key between people that are trying to communicate. Asymmetric encryption, where there's a public key and a private key that each person has. And we'll get into more detail about how that works. And then there's hashing, which are trapdoor or one-way functions that are used to sort of create digests. It's sort of like an extended checksum in many ways. Okay, so all of these three families are used in implementing digital currencies. So what are the characteristics we're looking for in crypto? It needs to be efficient, or not. It depends. For instance, if you're hashing passwords, and typically the way a good algorithm will hash a password is that it will do it like 500 times or 1,000 times. So if the algorithm is not very efficient, that slows down somebody who's trying to crack the password. So in fact, the algorithms that are used to hash passwords are much less efficient than the normal algorithms that you would use for hashing. The idea is that if you're going to hash a password, you really only have to do that once, unless you're an attacker and trying to crack it. Okay, so the other thing is that small changes in the input produce very large changes in the output. So that's pretty much, you can just change one character, like an A to a B, and you'll see complete difference in terms of what the encryption looks like. It should be standardized and vetted. Don't ever believe anybody that they've come up with their own unbreakable crypto algorithm. It's just not possible. Even the best people who design these algorithms, they submit them and, somebody will find out how to crack them. So the other thing is only the key is secret. So the code to implement the algorithm should be public. It's just the key that is secret. And And any implementation you have should come from a standardized library, not somebody's implementation or private implementation of it. It should be unbroken. Unbroken means that it's very difficult to actually come up with what the key is. Usually it requires basically a brute force attack that is proportional to the size of the key. If you can sort of trim that down so that you can actually discover the key in much less time, then it's considered broken. For instance, things like some of the weaker hashing algorithms, things like this, are now considered broken. And it should be computationally difficult to reverse. In other words, you have to solve a hard problem to come up with it, to come up with a key. So symmetric encryption, that's the first one, sort of the easiest. So Alice and Bob, in crypto we always talk about Alice and Bob wanting to communicate with each other, and Eve is the evil person who's trying to intercept a communication. So suppose they have kind of a lock. They have a lockbox. What they do is they each have a key to this lockbox, and they put the message in the lockbox and then send it over to the other one, and the other one has a key, and they unlock it. That's basically the way symmetric encryption works. Pretty simple. So in the digital case, you have a secure algorithm and then some key that you share, maybe a long key, that is used to share. Now, the major problem with symmetric encryption is always, how do you distribute the keys? So what happens if we want to include now Lois in the conversation? Except not all the time. So we can't give her just the same key that Bob and Alice have, because there are some times we don't want her to be able to communicate, and other times we do. So that means, okay, so we have to have, start with sort of like now, 3 factorial, or it goes up factorially as the number of groups and subgroups start increasing. So this quickly becomes untenable, and finally Diffie-Hellman, Whitfield Diffie and Hellman came up with a way of exchanging keys using a public key algorithm, and we'll get into that. And it uses a real-time algorithm to establish what is a shared key that can be used between two people that want to communicate in real time. So now back to Alice and Bob and the lockbox. So how do we do this? We have 2 keys, one for Bob, one for Alice. They have different keys. So now, the lockbox has sort of 2 openings on it. So for instance, Bob could put the message in there and lock it, and then send it to Alice. Then Alice locks it with her key. Sends it back to Bob. Bob unlocks his side, sends it back to Alice, and now she can unlock it, and voila, there's the message, and she can read it. Perfectly secure. A little inefficient, but perfectly secure. But not only is it efficient, notice that as we start to add people to the conversation, it increases the number of lockboxes. So now we've kind of saved the key distribution problem, but we have a lockbox problem. Because, well, what if instead of having lockboxes, we use padlocks instead? Because padlocks are easy to remove, right? Well, that sort of, does that solve the problem? And in some sense, it does solve the problem a little bit, but the problem we run into is, this is where the analogy breaks down. Because in the encryption case, if we encrypt something, and then encrypt it again with another thing, it's not reversible. You have to unpeel it in the reverse order that you encrypted it. So it's not quite the same problem. It's more like putting one lockbox inside another one, and then how do you get at the inside one? So it's not, that doesn't really work, but what if we use special padlocks? So imagine a padlock that has sort of two key openings. So Bob has a key that he can use to lock his side, and Alice has a key that she can sort of reverse that. If it's locked, she can use her key to lock it, to unlock it, and if she locks it, Bob can use his key to unlock it. But it has to be, if Bob locks it, Alice has to be the one to unlock it. So that's a very special kind of padlock. So that brings us to asymmetric encryption. There are two mathematical problems that are typically used in asymmetric encryption. One involves factoring large numbers, and that's what the RSA encryption algorithms are built around. The other concerns the elliptic curve discrete algorithm problem. And there are the URLs if you feel so inclined to actually investigate those further. The factoring large numbers, I think you probably know that that's kind of a difficult thing. If you have two large primes and multiply them together, then taking that result and figuring out what two prime numbers resulted in that is a difficult problem. So with the elliptic curve discrete algorithm problem, imagine, okay, suppose you were given a family, you were given 1 point on a plane. Well, there are an infinite number of straight lines you can draw through that. Now, if you were given 2 points, that determines a straight line, but it doesn't determine a parabola. There's still a whole family of parabolas that could go through those two lines. So in fact, in general, it takes, for any polynomial of degree n, it takes n plus 1 points to determine which curve actually goes through there. So there's a different family, not parabola, not conic section type things, but are not polynomial, but elliptic curves that act sort of the same way. So you could come up, you're given enough information initially only to know what family of elliptic curves you're talking about. Now, it turns out there are different sets of families of elliptic curves, and so this is one of the issues that came about from the Snowden revelations, where the NSA came up with a family of elliptic curves that was easier to crack than some of the others, and that turned out to be made into the default algorithm that was used in a lot of equipment. So you have to be careful about what family of elliptic curves you do use in the encryption algorithm. So in asymmetric encryption, each entity has two keys. One key is public, one key is private. Now you're sort of used to that in some way, right? User ID, password. User ID is public, password is private, right? The difference is that in that kind of situation, there's some central authority that you register somewhere and they control the authentication. With asymmetric encryption, just so long as I give you my public key, then you know that you can send me a message by encrypting it with my public key, and only I can read it because I have the private key, and that is the private key has to be used to decrypt the message. So you can lock with one key, unlock with the other. If I want to send a message to you, you tell me what your public key is. I use that to encrypt the message. Only you can read it because you have your private key. Does that all make sense? Any questions about that? So, that's how Bob and Alice now can not only that, they can, no, we'll get to that later. Okay, so that's the asymmetric encryption situation. The third thing is hashing. We said we wanted to get to that. So there are 4 properties of a hash algorithm. One, it has to be easy to compute. It should be infeasible. If you have a given hash, it should be infeasible to generate a message with that given hash. And you shouldn't be able to modify a message without changing the hash. And it should be infeasible to find 2 different messages with the same hash. So those are all properties that you want to have so that you can basically reasonably guarantee that if 2 messages have the same hash, that it's the same message, that it hasn't been changed. This is one way to really protect the integrity. It's used, for instance, to verify passwords. So that way, when you store somebody's password on your system, you don't actually store the plain text password, hopefully not. You actually store a hash of the password. In fact, you store a salted hash of the password that has been encrypted like 1,000 times, or hashed repeatedly like 1,000 times, or something like that. And you've used an algorithm like scrypt or bcrypt that has a higher work function associated with it. So that way you know that somebody has supplied the right password because it has the right hash. Okay, so one other concept that we need is this idea of Merkle trees. I have to admit, I went through my computer science classes a long time ago, and when I first ran into this, I thought, what is a Merkle tree? I've never heard of a Merkle tree. It turns out they were developed or invented by somebody named Merkle, but it was after I was through computer science, so of course I'd never heard of it. So the idea behind a Merkle tree is that suppose you have a whole bunch of elements down here, and you want to somehow make sure that none of these things have changed. So what you do is, it's pairwise, you compute the hash, and then compute the hash and just build up this binary tree until you have one hash clear at the top. And that, if that doesn't change, then that guarantees that everything down here hasn't changed. And it's very efficient in terms of determining if something is in there. Suppose what this diagram shows sort of that A2 there. So you wanted to check to see if that's in the chain. You would just have to compute the hash of this one, which goes here, the hash of this one, which goes here, and the hash of this one to go there. And you can, so you've got 1, 2, 3 hashes you have to compute to determine if that element's in the tree. And so finding something in the tree is very efficient, particularly as you get more and more of these things down here at the bottom, because it just increases as the log base 2 of the number of items, which is much slower than having to go back and recompute the hash of everything. Okay, so one more thing from crypto that we need is about digital signatures. So the reason you sign things, or digital signature gives the recipient the impression that, or the assurance that the sender has actually sent the message and they can't deny it, which is called authentication and non-repudiation. So you know who it is, and they can't back out. And that message was not altered. So that's a pretty strong statement. Now, that's actually much stronger than what we have in terms of signatures in the real world, where you're asked to sign something and you scrawl some thing on a piece of paper and you never know if anybody's changed anything above that. There's no verification that it's actually your signature. You're just asked to sign it. It's basically just used maybe after the fact if there is a problem, but there's really no verification that happens at the time. So this is a lot stronger than although it's called signature, it's really a lot stronger than what we think of as a signature in the real world. So in the asymmetric encryption case, remember the way I would send a message to Alice, I'm Bob, would send a message to Alice by encrypting it with her private key, right? Well, I'm sorry, I encrypt it with her public key. Yeah. And then I know that only she can decrypt it. Now, suppose that I also encrypt the message with my private key. So now I encrypt the message with my private key, encrypt the message with her public key, so when she gets it, she uses her private key to unwrap the first layer, and then uses my public key to unwrap the second layer. So that way, not only is the message secret, but she knows it came from me, because I'm the only one who could have encrypted it with my private key. So that's one way of signing. However, that's inefficient. Ugh. Public key cryptography is really compute intensive, particularly compared with symmetric encryption. So it's not something that we'd really do. So what we do is we use this digital signature algorithm, which is a standard. And to do that, we combine that thing that we just talked about with hashes into the public key infrastructure. So the way it works is, so we start over here with the message and the data, and we send it through a hash function. So that gives us probably like 32 bytes of just random characters. So that creates this message digest. Okay, and then we encrypt that with my private key. Now, then this goes over to the other side, to Alice. She takes the message data that she's decrypted, right? She puts it through the same hash function, gets out a message digest, and then uses my public key to decrypt this signature. And if what she gets from decrypting this signature agrees with this message digest, then not only has she validated that I've sent it, but she's validated that the message hasn't been changed. Is that clear? Everybody, raise out of your hand. Everybody understands that, right? Yay! Okay, very good. Too simple? Okay, so let's take a look. This is an amazing little website here. It's called blockchain.info. And this is a real-time display of Bitcoin transactions that are going on right now. Now, those Bitcoin transactions, let's see, I lost the pointer. All right. Oh, there it is. I just saw it. Okay, so let's look at transaction from a while ago Always dangerous when you just sort of pick one of these out, right? Okay, so here's a transaction where this is a Bitcoin address. It says that, you know, that says this is where the Bitcoin, I have stored some Bitcoins in the wallet. I'm going to send them from this address, and I'm going to send them over. I'm going to split it to these two addresses. Now, Bitcoins are just like money in the sense that they're really like coins. So if this would represent like a 10 francs or something like that, a bill, you send it over here, and guess what? You expect change back. So notice that this address is the same as this address. So I'm sending this Bitcoin to this address, 3.4 Bitcoins, and I'm also getting some money back. This is my change, because it's going back to the same address that sent it. Okay, now, the thing is that this address includes, guess what, a hash of a public key. And so there is a chain. This is built up in terms of, this display is different than what I looked at earlier. So this is built up in a ledger that keeps track of all the transactions. So you can actually follow this back to, suppose we click on this, and so this is an address. This is a hash, the hash of that address. Says it's received a total of 4,512 Bitcoins. And it's quotes a balance in there, but you can't really believe that. But the idea is that goes back, and you can track back all of the different places that have sent Bitcoins to this address, and then back another level and back another level, all the way back to the origin of that set of Bitcoins. So it's a ledger public ledger that gives the complete history of all of these Bitcoins. And it includes, like I said, the hash of the public key of the recipient. So this is the address, up here. This is the address the Bitcoin was sent to the last time. And with that public key, you have to send it over to the recipient. You give them the public key, and you've encrypted the coin with your private key. They can check to make sure the public key that you supply will allow them to decrypt the Bitcoin, and that the hash agrees with the public key that's in the hash there, because that's what guarantees that you have the right to actually send this to them. Now, we'll go through this again a little bit tomorrow. So this is kind of really complicated. I mean, every time I think I understand it, then I look at it a little bit more and think, huh? And then the light dawns again, and you go, wait, is this really right? Is this the way it works? So you're going to have to go through this multiple times to understand it. I'm not going to make it clear to you. I'm going to give you the first bit of confusion about how it all works. Okay, so let's go back here. So as you can see in this transaction, this is a typical example. So sometimes if you look at some of these displays, it will say this is the from address. This is not the from address. This is the address that the Bitcoin was last sent to. And so there's kind of a difference there. And again, here we have 0.225 bitcoins that are going to this address up here, and then the change that comes back that gets sent back to this address. This is not a good practice. In terms of privacy, the recommendation is that you should never send the change back to the same address, because from a privacy standpoint, it allows easier tracking of who is receiving the bitcoins. You can generate an infinite number of these in your wallet, so there's no need to send it back to the same address. You can easily send it to another made-up address, and that makes it much more difficult for somebody to track what it is that you've sent things on. And then you can go back, like I said, to the original. I actually went back. Picked out a transaction and stepped back through the history of that Bitcoin and got all the way back to the original allocation of 25 plus a little bit of Bitcoins, and just to see if I could, and it worked. I just about wore out the mouse button on my computer, though. Going back. Okay, so the transaction format, then, interesting thing is that you can have a list of inputs. And what does that mean? Okay, well, just like with a real transaction with coins, you don't necessarily give somebody one coin. You can give them a handful of coins, so long as the handful of coins adds up to more than the total that you want to spend. So you give them a handful of coins, a list of inputs, and then a list of outputs. You can pay more than one person, and you're going to expect maybe some change back. If the outputs do not add up to all of the things, all of the inputs, then the leftover goes to as a fee to the Bitcoin miner. We'll get to more about that, but that's considered a transaction fee, and it encourages the Bitcoin miner to actually deal with your transaction before he deals with other people's transaction. Well, again, we'll talk more about that. So you have the input, the input coins that you're going to spend, and then the outputs of where where that money is dispersed to, and then a lock time. The lock time is, if it's non-zero, can point to some future time. So this transaction can take place at some point in the future, and it's locked until then. For instance, somebody that wants to give his grandson money on his 18th birthday, he sort of presents it to him, but it's not valid until actually that amount of time, that time has passed. So, okay, so the input transactions, the ones that are up here, the list of inputs, what do those look like? There's the hash of the previous to be used transaction, a non-negative integer indexing the output to be used. Remember, when a transaction goes in, it can have multiple outputs, right? So you have to pick out the one that actually came to you, and that's the index that is used here. I had to look that up because I was really confused about what could that possibly be. And then it's the length of the script, and then there's a script here. This actually is a, have you ever heard of the language, computer language named Forth? Okay, so this is a Forth-like language that can be used here that describes the rules associated with how this money is, or, you know, how this value is dispersed. So there's actually a script here, and then the output is, of course, the number of satoshis. A satoshi is 100 millionth of a Bitcoin. So that is the unit in which the value is based. 1 over 10 to the minus 8. So you can imagine that you can move around some very small amounts of money if you want to. And then a script over here. This is sort of the second part of the script. So in terms of how this money is actually transferred. So this gives you a very powerful way. This is one way that they have of having like smart contracts, where you can basically have a programming language here. It's a restricted programming language. That actually controls under what conditions this gets dispersed. It's restricted. It can't reference things externally to itself. Like, if you want to, one example was the grandfather that wants to give his grandson this money on his 18th birthday or when he dies. And so there's no way to determine, there's no event that pops up. Okay, grandfather has died, disperse the money, right? You do have the time variable here, but that's all there is. So it can't reference that. But it really gives you powerful capabilities here in terms of how you can control the kinds of things that has to happen. For instance, you can say that, okay, 5 people have the ability to spend this money, and at least 3 of them have to agree that it should be spent. 3 people have to sign it before it's actually dispersed. Things like that, okay? So these transactions then go into a block. So the transactions flow out across the Bitcoin network, and it's a peer-to-peer network, and they just move all around. They all send the Bitcoins off to their neighbor. And they get put into a block. There are certain computer systems out there where people are actually gathering these together, putting them into a block, and doing what is called Bitcoin mining. Okay, so then they'll have a block, and what they're trying to do is come up with a hash such that the hash value is less than this number right here. And on average, with all of the miners out there, the difficulty is dynamically adjusted approximately every 2 weeks. The difficulty is adjusted dynamically so that it takes about, on the average, 10 minutes to solve this. So like I say, about every 2 weeks, 2016 blocks. Every 2016 blocks, they recompute the difficulty that should be associated that you have to find. You have to find a hash that is smaller than that. That means it has to have a whole bunch of leading zeros in the hash. You can see it here. See how many zeros are at the beginning? And here's the Merkle root that's in that block. Remember how we talked about all those transactions? So the way that we keep track of the transactions that are in a block is we form that Merkle tree. And so instead of hashing the whole block, we form the Merkle tree and put the root of the Merkle tree right up here in the block header. So the format then of the block header is that we have a magic number, which is always the same, a block size, the block header, which we'll get to in a minute, a transaction counter, which is the positive integer, and then the list of transactions that are to be included in the block. So these 6 items here are what we're going to hash. We have the block version number, a 256-bit hash of the previous block, of the previous header. That means that these are all in a chain, right? Because you always point to the hash of the previous block. And so it always builds on one another. Okay, so then you have the hash of, then you have the Merkle root. Boy, wrong button. Okay, so then the Merkle root. The current timestamp changes every few seconds. This is the current target in compact form, which is basically the number of bits it has to be at the beginning that's 0. And then the nonce. This is what you actually change to find the hash. So this nonce is a number that just starts at 0 and you just increment it. There are miners out there that are doing this at incredible rates. In fact, the hash rate is around, the current hash rate is around 300 petahashes per second. Petahashes per second. That is the rate at which the mining is going on, of people trying to find a nonce such that the resulting hash has the appropriate number of 0 bits at the front. It is amazing the amount of computing power that is going into this. Okay, so then we have a wallet. You can get money added to your wallet, a coin associated with a Bitcoin address. So it goes to the address, and then the address points to an account within the wallet. So the wallet sort of has like different pockets in it. And you might want to use those different pockets for different things, just like you might have a cash that you carry around, and then you have a checking account, and then maybe you have some investments and things like that. So there are other ways and other difficulty associated with getting money out of different kinds of accounts within a wallet. So like I said, the address contains a hash of the public key, and then the associated private key is used to lock the funds in the account. And it's very important to make sure that the wallet is encrypted somehow. And there is a really interesting web page here that tells you how to secure your wallet and how to do that for different kinds of wallets. There are different kinds. So in some cases, there are certain kinds of wallets for which you keep having to generate these different addresses, right? And each one of them has a public key associated with it. Well, then they have the private key. So, you need to back that up so that if your hard drive fails or your phone gets stolen or whatever, you have some way to recover those. Because if the private key is gone, the Bitcoin is gone. So this is what happened to Mt. Gox. I don't know if you've heard about that. It was an exchange that had millions of Bitcoin stored in it. Somebody got a hold of it, and all those Bitcoins just disappeared because the private keys went. So if once you lose your private key associated with one of these things, there's no recovering it unless you have a good backup. Now, there are some kinds of wallets where if you have the original seed that's used to generate the random keys, you can recover those things, a deterministic wallet. In other cases, those wallets aren't deterministic, and so you can't recover what those private keys are. That means that after you've generated a few more addresses here, you now have some private keys that aren't backed up. So you have to have some sort of regimen of making sure that you back this up, like at least on a weekly basis or something, so that you can actually recover these things. How are we doing on time? Okay. So there are different kinds of wallet types. The most secure type is a paper wallet. And so what happens is it's got a private key on it that you can print out. And it's just there. And you can then send money to the paper wallet. I have a QR code. You take a picture of it, send the money to that QR code. Now, one thing you don't want to do is you don't want to like post a piece of paper on your on your paper and then do a selfie that has the. If somebody can see the private key that's on that piece of paper, they can sweep all your funds into their account, and it's gone. It is gone. So you have to be very careful about that paper hard copy. There are now a couple of hardware devices where those can contain the private keys associated with your wallet, and then they're USB, and they plug in so that even you can use them supposedly on an untrusted computer. But they will just contain your private keys. An example of that one is called Trezor, Trezor. So that's one possibility. There are software wallets. Two examples are Bitcoin QT or Bitcoin D. Those are ones where you really need to make sure that you encrypt them and back them up. Now, the other thing you have to watch out for, you guys all know that when you delete a file, it's not really, it's still there, right? So suppose you encrypt this. And when you encrypt it, of course, you create a new file and delete the old unencrypted one, which, of course, is still sitting there in the free space on your hard drive. Well, this is like money, okay? You want to take care of it. That means that when you delete it, you actually want to do a secure erase. Now, there are certain sort of standard tools that people know how to do that with Mac OS and with Linux. There's one that applies to Windows that I wasn't even aware of. There's a command line utility called Cipher. C-I-P-H-E-R. And you can say Cipher and then W, colon, and then point to a directory. Now, it doesn't erase that directory. It erases all of the free space on the hard drive that contains that directory. It can take a long time if you've got a fairly empty, if you've got a lot of free space on your drive. But that is at least one way to do it. I wasn't even aware of that until I read through this stuff. I didn't know that command existed. And then online or mobile wallets. Typically speaking, those are easy to use, right? Which means they're less secure. If you have an online wallet, then basically somebody else is handling your cash for you. And so you use that for ready cash that you want to be able to spend. It's sort of like the cash you would carry with you. You don't carry your whole bank account with you in terms of so the same thing is true here. This is sort of like the cash you would want to have on hand to go around and buy something. So you can use these. These are different forms. You would, if you buy Bitcoin for investment or something like that, because you think the value is going to go up, then you probably want to just move it off to a paper wallet and just sort of keep that somewhere. If you're going to be spending Bitcoin, then you would at least want to have a small amount in your online or mobile wallet. Current prices are for Bitcoin about 300 euros per Bitcoin. Okay, so got a couple of minutes. Yeah, I remember this now. Okay, so I mean, this is a really interesting display here of, we've talked about, here are the different blocks that have been mined and how many minutes ago that they have been mined. the total amount of money that was sent, and the transactions in each block. You can see that varies pretty widely. Here, the size in kilobytes of that, and who was actually a successful miner. Now, we'll talk a little bit about tomorrow about mining. It's Satoshi's idea was that this mining would be spread out across the whole internet, and so it would be very distributed, and we wouldn't be. The idea was not to be associated with any sort of centralized group. The idea behind the blockchain and Bitcoin is it gets rid of the middleman. If you send money to somebody in a different country, then they get the Bitcoin and they can either keep it as Bitcoin or just transfer it to whatever their currency is. But you don't have to go through this long chain of banks and clearinghouses and all of that kind of stuff. The transaction of sending Bitcoin from me to you happens immediately. And when it's gone from my wallet, it's gone, just like cash. Okay, so this blockchain.info provides all sorts of ways of exploring things. You can click on a block number here, and you can see, okay, what were the transaction fees associated with this block? Remember, that was the difference between the inputs and the outputs. So if you have a little transaction fee in your transaction, that encourages a miner to put your transaction in a block when they're doing the mining. Now, the reason it's called mining is if they are successful in coming up with the correct hash, they get 25 Bitcoins. Well, think, 25 times 300 euros. Not an insignificant amount. The probability of them getting that, though, is quite small. So what they've done is that they've formed consortiums called mining pools, where everybody in the pool gets together and mines, and then you agree to divide up the spoils among all of you. And it turns out that there are such centralized now mining pools that one of them actually got to be more than 51% of all of the mining capability for the whole blockchain, which was very dangerous. And so they actually then backed off and promised that they would never exceed something like 30%, because we'll talk tomorrow about how that's very dangerous if you have more than 51% of the mining done by one group. Okay, so this block has, we talked about it, it's got this hash here with an appropriate number of zeros. This is the hash of the previous block, so that they're all chained together in one chain. And you can see what the difficulty was here. Okay, what time have we got? Let's go. Are there any questions? Yes. Oh, one thing I wanted to say is that this is disruptive technology. The possibilities are really endless for how the blockchain can be used. So one of the problems is because the possibilities are so rich, this can replace the stock market, it can replace all sorts of contracts, all sorts of, not only the financial area, but it's being used and thought of all sorts of different ways, wherever there's a transfer of value or wherever you want to have some algorithms for dealing with stuff. So, yes?
Hold on a second, because of the recording for CBS, you have to speak in the mic, I am told. Does it work?
Hi, why do you actually need to have change back? So when you actually do a Bitcoin transaction, why do you need to get change back? Why can't you just send the whole amount?
Well, you can send the whole amount, but you've gotten like 5 bitcoins and you only want to pay 3.
So why can't you send 3?
Because you have to send the whole. It's like you've got a 5 franc coin. How could you what do you do with it? Do you break it in 2 pieces? No, you can't. You have to send the whole thing in a transaction and then get change back. That creates a new change then to follow through with a reduced amount associated with that address.
So let's say you have 25 bitcoins and you want to pay 3. You just use all of the 25 bitcoins and then you get 22 back?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks.
That has just 3, and then, like, just in for yourself. Like, you could transfer 3 of your own bitcoins into a new wallet, and then use that wallet if you're worried about sending 25, which I don't know why you would be, but okay. No, I mean, but if you, because the number is attached to the address or to the wallet, so yeah.
So what I'm missing about this change back is how do you guarantee that the person who has to give the change back can make the change? Do you go back and forth a couple times, or?
No, that's the transaction. The transaction says, I'm sending money to these addresses, and just like the person, the 2 people receiving the money are the ones that you're sending it to, and yourself. So if the transaction is validated, then both of you get your money.
Okay.
It's sort of like when you give somebody a coin and you expect change back, what guarantee do you have? It turns out to be better than that. Because they don't get their money unless you get your money in terms of the change back.
So I have a question. So you mentioned that the mining involves finding a special hash.
Yes.
And if you find it, it's worth 25 bitcoins.
Right, plus the transaction fees that are in the block.
So how is now the Bitcoin technically defined? What is the relation? Because you can have some non-integer number of Bitcoins, but only integer number of hashes that are special, whatever you define special, like it starts with number of zeros or something. How are these two then connected? How do the Bitcoins depend on the special hashes?
So when you're building the block that you're going to hash, you include in there a transaction that is 25 bitcoins to you. So if you successfully come up with the proper hash for that, then that creates 25 bitcoins in your wallet. And that's called the Coinbase. So I'm not sure what. Can you ask again, or does that help at all?
So I guess I understand what a special hash could be. That
right.
You need to come up with an input that you put through a hash function and get, let's say, 10 zeros at the beginning. Now, what is the technical definition of a Bitcoin, mathematically?
It's this value, this number that goes through there, and this. It's all.
So it's somehow embedded in the definition of the block.
Yeah, I mean, it starts out that you get. I mean, the block when the transaction, the Bitcoin transaction at the beginning of the block, the Coinbase transaction, there says that you get 25 bitcoins, and so that puts 25 bitcoins in your wallet when you successfully get your block added to the blockchain. And so that creates 25 bitcoins. Now, right now, there are about 21 million bitcoins that have been mined. The maximum is 42 million. So every few years, the difficulty or the number of bitcoins that you get is cut in half.
So is this because the number of the special hashes is limited?
No. It's just the way it was designed. It was designed to go up to 42 million bitcoins and then stop. So after that time, the only reward that miners get will be based on transaction fees. They won't get any more bitcoins by mining, only transaction fees.
Okay, thanks.
I have seen somebody before. You are third.
Well, I was just wanted to clarify the change a bit. So each time you receive bitcoins, it's kind of a check that, and then when you spend the bitcoins, you have to use the whole check, of course, because you can't split it. So that's why when you spend the check, which contains all the bitcoins that you received in one transaction, then you have to send the leftovers to yourself in a new check. Maybe that clarifies it a bit.
He's happy. He agrees. So I saw somebody there, and then I saw two people here. You wanted to be last.
So for those of you who didn't hear, this is available for half price until 2 o'clock this afternoon. Pardon? No. But I bought it yesterday as soon as I saw the deal come out. So it's $14 instead of $28 for the electronic version.
Okay. So I guess I'm confused about the transaction being part of the block and the block defining the Bitcoin. So isn't this a chicken and egg problem? Because if we need transaction in order to define a Bitcoin, how we could have started with a Bitcoin without having transaction first?
There was a Genesis block. There was one block that Satoshi started with. And then they mined that, and then the blockchain got built up with successive miners then getting probably at that point 50 or 100 bitcoins for mining a block. But that was back in the days when bitcoins were worth, a few cents as opposed to 300 euros.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so we have two people here, including Stefan. And then raise your hands because I cannot see everybody. Please.
So just to clarify, so who does guarantee, so you said that the 25 bitcoins when a block is validated, so who does then guarantee that this 25, or who is the authority to set the price, if you want?
It's built into the algorithms that it gets cut in half every 10 years or something like that.
So in mining, you have to use those algorithms somehow?
Yeah.
It's a peer-to-peer. Got it. Yes, that makes sense. Thanks.
Stefan.
Thank you. Given this huge interest in your presentation and the ego of everyone to increase their salary, can you comment about computing resource policies, grid policies, and where you can run Bitcoin mining at CERN and on the grid?
Okay, I was going to cover that tomorrow more, but you ought to know that, for instance, by the time you buy a mining rig, in other words, to really mine Bitcoins, you have to get a very specialized set of hardware with ASICs that are set up to actually mine Bitcoins. And once you buy these, and then you pay for the electricity to run these, you do not end up with very many, it breaks even in about a year, I've heard. So the reward is very small unless you're using someone else's electricity. And the thing is that almost everybody now has policies against using their hardware to supply your Bitcoin mining. Okay, and I think you can see why. The thing is that being in the Bitcoin network means that you're going to have a particular port open. which is going to make it easy for them to see that you are doing mining. So there's no sense in trying to pretend that you and try to fake it. If you're opening that port, they're going to come find you. And the policies are going to be probably, you want to state what the reward is for finding a Bitcoin miner?
Oh, this is a professional fault. So don't run it in the CERN computer center. Don't run it on the grid. Just don't do it. Do it on your personal computer. You want to invest some time in some ASICs, but please don't do it if you want to see my office from the inside. And if you want to learn, who your direct supervisor and the HR department head is, this is a very, very straight way to that. So just please don't do that. I think CERN is tolerating the usage of the electricity for running your computer, and in the end, what's your computer doing all the day? It's just producing hot air and doing a little bit of calculation, so it doesn't change anything too much.
You are unlikely to successfully mine anything with a laptop.
Can you tell a bit more about those transaction fees? Is that the first miner forever gets all the time transaction fees on any transaction with his dug?
You get the transaction fee that is left over in any for the transactions that are in your block. So you get the transaction fees plus the 25 Bitcoins if you successfully mine the block. And the thing is that, if you're a miner, that you see these transactions coming in on the Bitcoin network, and you're going to be putting them assembling them in a block and trying to come up with the right hash. Well, if you're going to be picking from a bunch of transactions, you of course are going to pick the transactions that have fees associated with them, because that's going to get you more income. So does that answer your question?
So forever they would get transaction fees on that coin, whenever that coin is changed places?
No, no, only if it's in a block that you mine with that transaction.
I suggest that we wrap up, so we can have one very last question, and then we thank the speaker, and then we come back tomorrow, same time, same place. Do we have yes, we have one second question.
So you mentioned it's a disruptive technology. This question is more about the social side of the Bitcoin. It can replace the stock market. It can replace the chain of sending money from one country to another country. In principle, this endangers the groups of people involved in doing this, right? It means loss of job, loss of control for the governments, which many powerful people might not like.
Yes.
Is there already some response that these groups would try to somehow put Bitcoin down, make it illegal or something like that? Or how do you see this evolving in the future?
Well, for those of you that were listening at all to Bitcoin, you know that a year ago, November, there was a huge spike in the price of Bitcoins. It went up to over $1,000 per Bitcoin. The reason for that is the Chinese started using it and bidding up the price because they discovered this was a way to send money out of the country that couldn't be tracked. Then the spike came back down when the Chinese government put restrictions on them to do it. So, and then there was the Mt. Gox thing, and then it's basically leveled out to about 300 euros per Bitcoin. So yes, there are some very powerful interests that are going to try to, just like every other new disruptive technology that's come about, there are very powerful interests that are going to be lobbying with governments to put all sorts of controls on this, to put all sorts of restrictions. So far, for some reason, in most places, it's pretty freely available. I mean, I think the country that's most has the most adoption right now is the Netherlands. In fact, there was just a grocery store It opened in Amsterdam. That's in Amsterdam that started accepting Bitcoin. So there are like 40 businesses in Amsterdam that accept Bitcoin now. So it's something that is rolling along, and it'll be interesting to see how far it gets before the financial interests start to wake up and find out. This is all about what is called disintermediation. This is about taking out all of the middlemen, all of the things that are in the middle of doing a transaction. Companies are supposed to be viewed as persons, right, in terms of entities, and they create this thing that they sell shares of themselves, and people buy them and trade them, right? Well, this isn't any different, really. So, in fact, you can create a coin that is your coin, and you can sell shares in yourself. Why not? Now you've got stockholders that you've got to please, but at least you get some money coming, some stakeholder money to come in and maybe do something like produce a music record or something like that, and so then you pay out dividends to your shareholders, and it can all be done through this Bitcoin type mechanism. So why not sell some shares in yourself if you need to raise money? You just need to convince somebody that this is worthwhile. Yeah, well, exactly.
They can't enslave you anymore by getting their money, so they will work against it.
Yeah, so at some point in time, it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out, because there is a fixed rate of inflation. There's also a fairly standard rate at which Bitcoins are getting lost. About 9% of the Bitcoins that have been mined so far have disappeared and are lost.
So,
okay.
As a sponsor, I would like to thank you all for coming, to remind you that this is academic training, to second Stefan, our computing security officer, that this is your business in your private time, which I don't know how much you have, but this is not supposed to be direct teaching or encouragement for doing financial transactions in the future. And hope to see you here tomorrow, and thank the speaker very much for this.